Do you believe in miracles, or mysteries that defy all logic? Dog face baby, imagine this. Your dog gives birth, and among the puppies, something appears that will change your life forever. A human baby. This really happened. And today, you're going to uncover every detail of this unbelievable story that left a small community in absolute shock. Get ready to understand what led to this astonishing moment, how the town reacted, and how this story goes far beyond anything you could imagine. But first, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on more unique stories like this one. And drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Let's dive into this journey together. Augusto Martin was the kind of man people in the small mountain town rarely spoke to, and never spoke about unless they had to. His farm, sitting at the far end of a winding dirt road, was well known but rarely visited. Locals whispered about the strict gates, the barking dogs, and the relentless solitude that surrounded it. They also recalled how different Augusto had been when his wife, Elisa, was still alive, how his smile came easily, and how he never shied away from a good neighborly chat. But Elisa's tragic death from an aggressive cancer left him hollow, turning him into a ghost that haunted the fringes of the community. In the crisp morning light, the scent of freshly baled hay blended with a sense of unease that seemed to linger around Augusto's property. The only living soul he ever confided in was his dog, Estrella, a fiercely loyal German Shepherd mix with a thick, dark coat. For months, Augusto had waited anxiously for her to give birth, knowing these puppies were a rare source of hope, even if just a faint one. It was on a chilly early fall day, a few days after the puppy's long-awaited arrival, that the world around Augusto would shift forever. While checking on Estrella and her newborns in the old barn, he noticed something out of place, something impossible. The barn was damp and dimly lit. A single beam of sunlight cut through the dusty air, landing on a small wooden crate where Estrella had made her nest. Augusto crouched down and counted the puppies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right in the middle of them, wrapped in the warmth of Estrella's fur, was an infant, a human baby boy, no more than a few weeks old. He froze, unable to move or speak. The puppy nearest to the baby whined softly, and Estrella raised her head, offering no explanation, just a calm acceptance of the bizarre scene. Blood pounded in Augusto's ears. His mind raced with questions no rational person could answer. How? Why here? Who would abandon a baby among newborn puppies? He lifted the child gently. The baby's face was pale and delicate, yet there was a fierceness in its cries that jolted Augusto's dormant paternal instincts he had buried after Elisa's death. He noticed a simple white blanket tucked around the baby's tiny form. No name, no note, no identification. And in that moment, all the pain and memories he had bottled up threatened to burst free. Before he could fully process what was happening, Estrella nudged his arm, drawing his attention back to the puppies. They scurried around, blissfully unaware of how their lives had changed. Augusto's rough hands cradled the baby more tightly, and a strange resolve took hold of him, an unwavering responsibility he felt, despite every broken part of him screaming otherwise. Confusion overshadowed his usual stoic mask. He knew people in town would talk. They would come up with their wild theories, they would pry, they would judge. But somewhere deep in his heart, perhaps in the darkest corners where Elisa's memory still lived, he realized this was something he could not ignore. Overcoming an internal battle raging within, Augusto hurried inside the house with the baby in his arms. The weight of this new reality pressed on him like a vice. Outside, the wind rustled across the field, carrying with it the promise of secrets yet to be unearthed. The silence of the farm had finally been broken. Augusto had barely come to terms with the baby's sudden appearance when the news spread like wildfire. Despite his attempt to keep everything quiet, small-town curiosity burned bright, and by midday, nearly every resident in the village knew that a newborn infant had been discovered in the barn of the aloof hermit, who lived up on the hill. Whispers at the diner. The village's one diner, Redwood Eats, was the epicenter of chatter. Under the glow of flickering neon lights, people at every table passed around the latest rumor, each version growing more dramatic by the minute. There was Mrs. Hopkins, the self-appointed moral compass of the town, declaring it a divine sign for Augusto, a once sociable man who turned into a reclusive figure after losing his wife to cancer. In a corner booth, two rugged farmhands debated the possibility of a sinister plot. Maybe the baby was part of a government experiment or some unknown cult. At the counter, Mr. Clarkson, the local handyman, looked doubtful and muttered darkly about how it might be a trick meant to tarnish Augusto's name. Snippets of conversation floated through the air. Did you hear he found the child in the middle of a litter of puppies? That can't be natural. I'd sooner believe pigs can fly than think Augusto's telling the whole story. God bless that poor man. He's gone through too much grief already. Maybe this is the Lord's way of giving him hope. Across the room, eyes darted furtively at each other, and not a single detail escaped the swirling rumor mill. It took on a life of its own, feeding off the community's collective curiosity. Like a match to dry tinder, the baby's miraculous discovery sparked fascination, skepticism, and even fear. Behind the tall gates meanwhile, beyond the chatter and speculation, Augusto tried in vain to keep his home life private. The tall, creaking gates that surrounded his property were meant to keep prying eyes away, but they also underscored the isolation he had embraced for years. Before, no one had reason to visit. Now, the baby's presence drew attention like a magnet. Inside the farmhouse, the baby's cries shattered the stillness. The sound was so unexpected, part joyous, part overwhelming, that Augusto found himself struggling to think clearly. He hadn't planned for anything like this. He was unprepared for diapers, blankets, or the way a tiny infant could pierce his emotional defenses with nothing more than a wail. He kept recalling images of Elisa, her soft smile filling his mind every time he tried to push away the memory. They had talked about having children once, about naming them, raising them to run free through the fields, teaching them to love the land as much as they loved each other. But death had snatched away those dreams. Now, with this mysterious child lying in a makeshift crib fashioned from a wooden crate, Augusto felt the old dreams stirring like ghosts in the corners of his mind. Journey into town that afternoon, nerves frayed by the baby's increasing fussiness, Augusto realized he needed supplies, and he needed them fast. Gritting his teeth, he bundled the infant into a soft blanket, gingerly placed him in a worn wicker basket, and loaded him into his old pickup truck. The ride down the hill and along the main road was tense. Augusto couldn't shake the feeling that half the town would be watching, waiting for him to show up with the baby they'd all heard about but few had actually seen. Upon arriving at the town's modest pharmacy, a quaint building with chipped white paint and a hand-painted sign, Augusto was greeted by stillness. Wind chimes rattled outside, and a bell jingled overhead when he pushed the door open. It was a small space cluttered with wooden shelves lined with remedies, baby powders, cough syrups, and homemade soaps. Everything smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax, a comforting if slightly overpowering scent. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly pharmacist with gentle wrinkles and observant eyes, stood behind the counter. She offered him a sympathetic smile, one that spoke volumes. She knew the rumors, but she also sensed this wasn't the time for prying questions. "How can I help you, Augusto?" she asked politely. Her gaze flickered to the basket. The baby squirmed and let out a tiny, mewling cry. Augusto cleared his throat. I need formula. And diapers. Some bottles, too, I guess." He glanced down, feeling awkward and exposed. This new role, temporary guardian or whatever fate had cast him as, felt jarringly alien. Carefully, Mrs. Rodriguez selected the items he needed, adding a small tin of baby ointment and a handful of pamphlets about infant care. Though she never voiced her curiosity, her face was etched with concern. It was as if she wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Are you okay? Are you sure you can manage? Yet held them back out of respect. He paid in tense silence, nodding in thanks before hurrying back to his truck. All the while, he sensed the eyes of a few customers who had drifted in from the street, each trying to catch a glimpse of the fabled baby. The second he climbed into the driver's seat, heart pounding, he felt a swirl of relief and dread. This one errand had gone smoothly, but the entire town was already set ablaze with speculation. A seed of compassion on the slow drive home, the baby's cries softened, and Augusto found himself glancing over his shoulder, almost to reassure the little one that everything would be okay. A flicker of guilt crept through him. He had spent years pushing people away, walling off his heart, and living a solitary existence to avoid the pain of remembering Elisa. Now, this tiny soul, so fragile and dependent, was chipping away at his hardened shell. Despite the swirling gossip and the emotional upheaval, he felt a stirring of protectiveness. The baby, still unnamed, represented something beyond Augusto's understanding. Perhaps a chance to heal, or a reminder of everything he had lost. By the time he pulled up to the tall iron gates of his farm, the sun was dipping low in the sky, painting the fields in a golden hue. Estrella, his loyal German shepherd mix, bounded up to meet the truck, tail swishing in a friendly greeting. She seemed to sense the importance of the child, peering curiously into the basket as Augusto carried the baby into the house. No matter how deeply he resented the prying eyes of the townspeople or how jarring these changes felt, Augusto knew one thing for certain: he had a responsibility now, an unexpected, life-altering responsibility that he couldn't simply cast aside. And as the last rays of daylight washed through the farmhouse windows, Augusto cradled the baby in his arms. In the quiet, he heard only two heartbeats, his own, which had been guarded for years, and the baby's, beating steady and sure. For the first time since Elisa's death, Augusto felt the faintest sign of hope. The outside world might be consumed by speculation, but in this moment, within these four walls, he and the child existed in a fragile yet profound sense of connection. 2 days passed, and Augusto made sure to keep the baby fed and warm. He even rigged up a makeshift bassinet from an old wooden crate lined with blankets. He didn't sleep much, jolting awake with every tiny whimper. Early on the third day, just as the first rays of sun tinted the horizon, the sound of tires crunching on gravel echoed across the yard. Augusto peered through the kitchen window to see a police cruiser rolling up to the house, dust swirling in its wake. He opened the door to find Sheriff Nolan and Deputy Harris standing on the porch. Sheriff Nolan, a middle-aged man with a salt-and-pepper mustache, removed his hat politely. "Morning, Augusto," he said, eyeing the baby's carrier on the kitchen table. "Word's going around town you found, well, you know." Augusto's jaw clenched. He nodded curtly, stepping aside to allow them in. He could sense the tension, the subtle suspicion in their eyes. After all, how could a baby just appear on a farm? "We want to help," Sheriff Nolan offered, his voice even. "Any clue as to how the baby got here? Did you see anyone lurking around?" Augusto shook his head. "No. I just found him there," he said, struggling to keep his emotions in check. He was accustomed to the role of town outcast, but this time, he had no explanation. The sheriff glanced at the baby and softened his tone. "All right. The state child services will have to be informed. But until we find the mother, or figure out the situation, we'd like you to keep him safe, if you're willing. Unless you'd rather he go to a foster home." The thought of handing the child to strangers set Augusto on edge. Despite his reluctance, something in him refused to let go. "I'll look after him," he replied. "For now." Sheriff Nolan nodded and headed back out, leaving an unspoken warning in the air: this wasn't over. Someone out there had abandoned a baby in bizarre circumstances. And the clock was ticking. Word travels fast in a small village, and the mysterious baby on Augusto's farm quickly became everyone's favorite topic. Yet the man himself remained as unreachable as ever, holed up in his old farmhouse, rarely venturing into the public eye. Curiosity drove some townsfolk to make the trek up the hill, but each time they found the gates locked, the barking of Augusto's dog, Estrella, warning them away. Despite this barrier, there was one person who knew better than to be deterred by a reputation for solitude: Maria Santos. Maria Santos, the compassionate nurse Maria, had lived in the village her entire life. In her youth, she dreamed of becoming a doctor, but circumstances and finances led her to train as a nurse instead. She opened a modest health clinic on the edge of town, where she treated anyone and everyone in need, no questions asked, no payment required for those who couldn't afford it. Years ago, she had helped Elisa during the final, grueling weeks of her cancer battle, making house calls to ease Elisa's pain when hospitals were too far and too cold. She remembered the warmth of Elisa's smile, the look of determination mixed with heartbreak on Augusto's face, and the tangible love that bound them. When Elisa passed, Maria stopped hearing from Augusto altogether. She had tried to reach out, but he had shut down completely, retreating behind his farm's gates and his own grief. So when rumors began swirling about a baby on Augusto's property, Maria's heart ached with a blend of hope and concern. On one hand, it was hard to imagine Augusto willingly caring for an infant. On the other, she couldn't shake the feeling that fate had intervened. Perhaps, somehow, Elisa's spirit was at work, guiding events from beyond. Arrival at the farm one sunny morning, Maria filled a small wicker basket with a handful of essentials: baby formula, a couple of baby bottles, a few diapers, and a cozy blanket she had sewn herself. She also threw in a little stuffed lamb, thinking a soft toy might offer comfort to a child thrust into such strange circumstances. After driving her aging sedan up the winding dirt road, she reached the iron gates. A wave of apprehension rolled over her. Would he even let me in? The gates were imposing, and anyone in town could tell you Augusto rarely opened them to visitors. However, before she could knock, Estrella, Augusto's loyal German Shepherd mix, trotted up. The dog, a usually fierce guard, seemed almost relieved to see Maria, wagging her tail in cautious greeting. Maria bent down, offered the back of her hand, and Estrella gave it a tentative sniff before stepping aside. Moments later, the front door opened just enough for Augusto to peer out. His eyes, dark from restless nights, fell on the nurse, then on the basket she carried. He seemed torn between telling her to leave and acknowledging that help might be precisely what he needed. After a tense pause, he unlatched the door with a sigh. "Maria," he said stiffly, stepping back to let her in. She could sense his discomfort. Accepting help wasn't in his nature. She followed him down a short hallway into a living room that bore signs of a hasty reconfiguration. An old wooden crate had been lined with blankets and propped up on a sturdy chair, serving as a makeshift crib. Inside it lay the baby, eyes closed, tiny hands curled into fists. The soft hush of his breathing filled the otherwise silent room. First encounter with the baby, Maria placed her basket on a nearby table and approached the crate carefully. The baby stirred, blinking awake. She noticed at once that he was well cared for so far, clean, warm, and free of any visible sores or rashes. Impressed, she shot Augusto a glance. "You've done well, considering," she said gently. Augusto, standing like a statue a few steps away, shrugged. "I'm just trying to make sure he's okay." Though he tried to sound detached, the concern in his voice was unmistakable. Maria's gaze lingered on him for a moment before turning back to the baby. She lifted the child with the practiced ease of a seasoned caregiver and began a quick check of vitals: heart rate, skin tone, reflexes. The baby's coos echoed in the small room, and Maria couldn't help but smile. "He's strong," she remarked. Surprisingly so, for someone found in such an unusual situation. Augusto swallowed hard. He looked exhausted, haunted, even, but also uncharacteristically alert, as though the baby's well-being had become his sole purpose. Offering practical help satisfied that the child was in good health, Maria retrieved the supplies from her basket. She handed Augusto a small box of formula and showed him how to mix it properly, giving him tips on feeding schedules and bottle sterilization. Her explanations were methodical yet tender, the kind of reassurance only a skilled nurse could provide. Augusto hovered, arms folded over his chest. His guarded expression never fully softened, but he asked questions, clearly intent on getting it right. How often do I feed him at night? What do I do if he gets a fever? Is there a certain way I should hold him after feeding? Each question revealed a crack in the tough exterior he had cultivated since Elise's death. Maria answered patiently, demonstrating techniques on how to burp the baby, how to change diapers without fussing, and how to keep the baby warm but not overheated. Breaching the subject of the mother eventually, Maria's curiosity got the better of her. After all, the entire village was abuzz with gossip, and no one had any solid information about where this infant had come from or who had abandoned him. "Are you sure you have no idea who might have left him in your barn?" she asked softly. Augusto's face darkened. "No," he said, voice clipped. "I just found him there, with the puppies. It doesn't make any sense." A silence settled between them. Maria recognized the pain in his eyes, the same look he'd had when Elisa fell sick, that feeling of helpless confusion. She wanted to offer comfort, but she sensed this was a wound Augusto wasn't ready to bear. Instead, she changed topics. Choosing a name, noticing that calling the baby he or the child felt awkward and impersonal, Maria broached the subject of a name. "He's going to need a name," she said gently, rocking the baby as he drifted towards sleep. "Otherwise, how can we even fill out any documents for him?" Augusto, caught off guard, paused as if the idea had never occurred to him. He glanced at the tiny face, still pink and scrunched in sleep. A flicker of memory flashed across his features. "Matteo," he finally whispered, voice rough with emotion. "Elisa, she always liked that name." Maria's heart clenched. She had been close enough to Elisa to know the name meant gift of God. Perhaps it was no coincidence that this baby had appeared when Augusto needed him most, just as Elisa had once said that life could bring the unexpected. "Matteo Martin, then," she said, offering a small, encouraging smile. "It has a nice ring to it." Augusto let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. In that moment, something shifted in the air between them, a mutual understanding that, despite the bizarre circumstances and Augusto's solitary nature, the welfare of this child came first. A newfound resolve. After an hour or so of gentle instruction, Maria gathered her empty basket and made her way to the door. Before leaving, she paused and locked eyes with Augusto. "If you need help, any kind of help, call me," she said firmly, placing a slip of paper with her personal number on the worn coffee table. He nodded, a silent acceptance of her offer. Though he still looked uneasy, there was a spark of determination in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Caring for Matteo might be the hardest thing he'd ever done, especially given the ghosts of his past, but he would do it. Maria stepped outside, the sunlight casting long shadows across the yard. She couldn't help but smile as she heard the baby's muffled cries drifting through the open window. For all the heartache that had consumed Augusto since Elisa's passing, the presence of Matteo promised the possibility of healing, no matter how unexpected, no matter how many rumors swirled around them. As she drove away, Maria felt both relieved and worried. Relieved because the baby was in safe hands, and worried because of the many unanswered questions that lingered. Who abandoned Matteo? Why Augusto's barn of all places? And what mysteries lay buried in Augusto's past that might be connected to this child? The only certainty was that Matteo had already begun to transform Augusto's life, and perhaps the entire village, by simply existing. Whether that transformation would be peaceful or tumultuous remained to be seen. In the following weeks, life on the farm transformed. Instead of the hollow silence, there were soft cries at night and the smell of baby powder in the morning. It was unsettling, but also strangely comforting. Nevertheless, whispers continued swirling in town. Some people still believed Augusto was involved in something sinister. Others claimed the baby was a sign from God, a second chance for the grieving widower. Religious fervor took root among a few villagers, who began holding prayer circles outside the farm's locked gates. But the biggest shift happened inside Augusto. Each time he fed Matteo or cradled him to sleep, he felt the faint stirrings of hope, and with it came memories of Elisa's final days. Her once bright eyes had dulled with pain, yet she had never lost her gentle spirit. Before she passed, she told Augusto to keep his heart open to life's unexpected gifts. He had failed to do so, until now. One night, while searching for extra blankets in an old trunk, Augusto stumbled upon a dusty stack of letters and a small locked journal belonging to Elisa. The letters were addressed to someone named Lucia, a person he had never heard Elisa mention before. "My dear Lucia," one letter began, "I'm writing to you in the greatest hope that you'll understand the decision I've made." The rest was cryptic and hinted at a secret Elisa had been harboring. Augusto's breath caught in his throat. What could Elisa have been hiding? And why had he never known about it? A knot of unease settled in his stomach as he realized this mystery might tie back to Matteo's sudden appearance. Morning arrived with a pale light filtering through the threadbare curtains in Augusto's cramped study. The old farmhouse creaked under the shift from night to day, as if announcing that yet another dawn had come, and with it, more questions that weighed heavily on Augusto's mind. Papers, old letters, and a small locked journal lay scattered across the scarred wooden desk. He hunched over them, eyes red from lack of sleep. Each page he read tugged at the edges of a long-buried past he was only now beginning to uncover. Elisa's hidden correspondences since finding the letters from Elisa to someone named Lucia, a name he'd never heard Elisa mention. Augusto had become obsessed with deciphering their contents. Phrases like "new life," "grave responsibility," and "the secret I must protect" jumped out at him, sending his mind spinning with half-formed theories. Elisa's handwriting, once so comforting, now felt almost foreign. It carried an urgency that prickled the back of his neck, as if she knew her time was short and that she had something vital to achieve before her illness claimed her. Many of the passages referenced what appeared to be a deeply guarded plan, one involving uncertain medical treatments and the hope of leaving a piece of herself behind. Augusto read each letter over and over, trying to piece them together like a puzzle. How had he missed all this when she was alive? Why would Elisa keep such a massive secret from him, the very person she had trusted enough to marry? He couldn't shake the feeling that these hidden writings were linked to Matteo, the baby he had found in the barn. If Elisa had truly been involved in something experimental, could that explain Matteo's almost miraculous appearance? Was this child, impossibly, connected to her in ways that defied logic? The phone call engrossed in the puzzle. Augusto nearly jumped out of his chair when the phone rang, a sharp jolt in the hushed stillness of the house. Before picking up, he glanced at the clock on the wall, barely 7 a.m. No one ever called him this early unless it was urgent. He lifted the receiver to hear Sheriff Nolan on the other end. The man's usually easygoing drawl sounded tense. "Augusto, we've got a lead on who might have left that baby on your property," the sheriff said without preamble. "I need you to come by the station." Augusto's heart sank. The sheriff's words contained the one fear that had been circling his mind like a vulture. If the authorities found the baby's biological family, would he lose Matteo? A bead of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "Who is it?" Augusto asked, forcing his voice to remain level. There was a pause on the line. Well, we got a call from a woman named Lucia Alvarez. Says she knew Elisa. She's insisting she talked to you directly. In that instant, Lucia ceased to be just a name in Elisa's secret letters. She was real, tangible, and apparently on her way to the small town. The phone line crackled as Sheriff Nolan continued, "She's coming in this weekend. Says it's urgent. I'm not sure what her angle is, but I figure you'd want to hear her out, considering she claims to have information about the baby. Let's keep this low-key for now, though. We don't need more gossip." Augusto whispered his agreement, his mind reeling. He set the phone back on its cradle with a trembling hand. If Lucia Alvarez truly had ties to Elisa's past, she might hold answers that would upend everything he thought he knew. A town's watchful eyes, despite wishing he could bury his head in the sand, Augusto knew he had to comply. After settling Mateo in the makeshift crib, a worn bassinet with fresh blankets, he gathered his jacket and stepped outside. The chilly morning air bit at his face as he climbed into his old pickup truck. Estrella, his faithful dog, watched him from the porch, ears perked as if sensing his unease. The drive to the sheriff's station took him past the downtown strip, where curious onlookers and loitering townsfolk cast sidelong glances at his truck. He didn't miss the way people paused mid-conversation to stare as he passed, the old recluse who found a baby in his barn. Gossip seemed to cling to him like a stubborn shadow. By the time he reached the station, a small, boxy building with faded lettering on the window, his nerves were on edge. The few people milling about outside gave him wary, questioning looks, as if his every move was a piece in a larger puzzle. He parked and forced himself to ignore the whispers, stepping inside with a tight jaw. Inside the station's interior smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paperwork. Faded, wanted, and missing posters lined a corkboard near the entrance, their edges curled from age. Sheriff Nolan spotted Augusto immediately and waved him over. Standing beside the sheriff was Deputy Harris, a younger man who looked equally anxious. "Augusto," Sheriff Nolan greeted him curtly, ushering him toward a cramped office space. "Thanks for coming in." Inside, the sheriff closed the door, muffling the low hum of conversation in the main lobby. With a sigh, he leaned against an old metal filing cabinet. "Lucia Alvarez contacted us late last night. Says she's Elisa's cousin or something along those lines. I ran her name through our system, nothing questionable popped up, so I agreed to meet with her. She insisted you be here when she arrives." Augusto's mouth felt dry. The mention of cousin rattled him. Elisa had never spoken of extended family, let alone someone she was close enough to confide in. "How do we know she's telling the truth?" he asked quietly. Deputy Harris set a thin file on the desk. "We did a quick background check, nothing special. She's from a neighboring state, works for a nonprofit, no criminal history. She claims she only recently learned about a baby possibly connected to Elisa. And now she's coming to see you." Augusto stared at the worn floor tiles. "So Elisa had family she never told me about. Why would she keep them a secret, especially if she was corresponding with this Lucia behind my back?" The weight of uncertainty before he could voice these questions, the sheriff continued, "Look, Augusto, I'm only telling you this because I know how important this might be for you. But be careful. We don't know if she's telling the truth or if she just wants something from you. And if she's claiming any parental rights over the baby, or if she knows who the mother is, this could get complicated real fast." The thought of losing Mateo, a child he had come to believe might be connected to Elisa's final wishes, sent a sickening jolt through Augusto's gut. His arms tensed at his sides, and he drew in a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "I'll talk to her," he said, voice strained. "I need answers." Sheriff Nolan nodded, relieved at Augusto's cooperation. "She arrives Saturday morning. I'll let you know the time so you can come here." Don't worry, we'll keep it civil. A path unfolds leaving the station felt like stepping onto a stage under harsh lights. Every eye in the lobby, and even the few pedestrians outside, seemed to track Augusto's steps. Once in the sanctuary of his truck, he sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened. His mind swirled with dread and anticipation. The quiet, lonely existence he'd clung to for years was unraveling. Fate, or perhaps Elisa's hidden plans, was pulling him down a path he never asked to follow. Yet despite his fear, he felt a whisper of resolve. If Lucia held the key to Matteo's origins, and if those origins truly stemmed from Elisa's final efforts, he had no choice but to face whatever truth emerged. As the truck rumbled to life and pulled away from the station, the early morning sun caught the cracked windshield in a blinding glare. Augusto squinted, reminded once again that the road ahead was fraught with uncertainty. Still, an unfamiliar spark of hope mingled with his apprehension. For the first time in years, he found himself on a collision course with the past he tried so hard to forget, entangled with the present that arrived screaming in his barn. And even though it terrified him, Augusto couldn't ignore the unshakable feeling that he was moving closer to something that would change his life, possibly forever. The weekend came, and with it, Lucia Alvarez. She was a slender woman with dark hair neatly pulled back, wearing jeans and a simple blouse. Despite her calm demeanor, her eyes held a weary intensity. They met at Maria's clinic, a neutral spot where Lucia could see Matteo in a safe environment. When she laid eyes on the baby, her breath caught, and she whispered, "So it's true." Augusto studied her, tension thrumming in his veins. "You knew Elisa?" he asked, trying to keep an even tone. "I found letters she wrote to you. Something about a secret." Lucia's eyes brimmed with tears. "Elisa was my cousin. We grew up together. After she married you, we lost touch for a while, but then she reached out. She wrote that she discovered something life-changing, something involving an experimental procedure. She was desperate, Augusto." Augusto's mind spun. Experimental procedure. Elisa had never mentioned anything about seeking advanced treatments or participating in research. She was sick. "We tried different doctors and medications, but nothing experimental," he murmured, half to himself. Lucia exhaled shakily. There was a doctor, Dr. Guillermo Ramirez, researching cutting-edge fertility and cancer treatments. Elisa was determined to try it, but it was risky and highly secretive. "She told me she was hoping, well, to have your child before it was too late." Augusto's stomach twisted. "That's impossible. Elisa never. She wrote me a month before she passed," Lucia interrupted gently, saying she'd seen results that gave her hope. She believed, somehow, a miracle could happen. His eyes moved to Matteo, the baby now snoozing contentedly in Maria's arms. A surreal thought flickered through his mind: could Matteo be ours? Spurred by Lucia's words, Augusto dove headfirst into investigating Dr. Guillermo Ramirez. Maria helped him search medical databases, while Lucia contacted old leads. They discovered Dr. Ramirez had once run a clinic for groundbreaking cancer treatments. The official records indicated the clinic was shut down under suspicious circumstances, something about unapproved embryo research. In the quiet evenings, after putting Matteo to bed, Augusto pored over Elisa's letters, searching for any reference to this doctor's experiments. One letter stood out: "Lucia, I know it's risky. The treatments are not just for my cancer. They promise new life, both physically and spiritually. If it works, I might have a chance to carry on a piece of me, of us." If these cryptic words were true, it could mean Matteo was the result of Elisa's desperation to leave a legacy, a child that somehow survived despite her passing. But there was still the question of who had left the baby in the barn. And why? Late one night, Lucia confided in Augusto, Dr. Ramirez vanished when the clinic closed. I fear he might be behind Mateo's sudden appearance. Either he, or someone connected to him, had a reason to deliver the child to you. But why in such a strange way? Augusto asked. Maybe because it was the only way to force you to take him in. If they tried to contact you directly, who knows how you would have reacted? Augusto felt a pang of guilt. Before all this, he would have slammed his door in anyone's face, denying any connection to the outside world. But faced with a helpless baby, and memories of Elisa, his heart had changed. No sooner had they begun to piece together the truth than a new thread emerged. One morning, Augusto found his mailbox smashed and a chilling note scrawled on torn paper: "Stop asking questions, or you'll lose him." Fury and fear collided in Augusto's chest. Whoever left the note didn't want the secrets of Dr. Ramirez's clinic unearthed. Determined to protect Mateo, Augusto fortified the house, installed new locks, and began carrying a rifle whenever he went out to tend the fields. Meanwhile, Maria and Lucia refused to sit idle. They reached out to old medical colleagues, only to find them too frightened to talk. Whispers of illegal research, powerful backers, and vanished patients painted a grim picture. A break finally came when Lucia got an anonymous email with an address for Dr. Ramirez's possible hideout, a rundown motel a few hours away. Urgency crackled in the air. If they could confront Ramirez, maybe they could confirm Mateo's origins and ensure no harm came to the child. That evening, leaving Mateo in Maria's capable care, Augusto and Lucia drove toward the motel under a stormy sky. Lightning flashed across distant mountains, a fitting backdrop to the storm of emotions raging inside Augusto. "Elisa, if only you could see us now. I'll fight for him, I swear." They found Ramirez trembling behind the half-closed door of his dingy motel room. His once proud bearing had crumbled. Seeing Lucia, he broke down, confessing everything in a shaky voice. We managed to save one embryo before Elisa's final relapse. I kept it safe, but by the time it was viable, Elisa was gone. I couldn't let them destroy it. The people funding the clinic wanted to dispose of all evidence to avoid legal consequences. I had to rescue him. I gave the baby to someone I trusted, begging them to deliver him to you, Augusto. He's your son. The raw truth was more than Augusto had dared to hope for or imagine. Tears blurred his vision, and he staggered back against the wall, reeling. Mateo is mine, and Elisa's. A child born from her final wish. But Dr. Ramirez warned that danger was closing in. The ones behind this will do anything to erase the evidence. They threatened me, too. Augusto clenched his fists. He thought about the cryptic note. The smashed mailbox. No one will take Mateo from me. Back at the farm, a tense calm settled over the property. Augusto, Lucia, and Maria prepared for what felt like a final stand against whoever sought to eliminate Mateo. They secured phone lines, watched for suspicious cars, and stationed themselves near entrances. Night fell, and thunder rumbled in the distance. In the flickering lamplight, Augusto fed Mateo. Emotions churned in him like a storm: grief for Elisa's loss, wonder at the miracle she orchestrated, and fierce protectiveness for this fragile life now in his arms. When a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, Augusto's heart pounded. He motioned for Lucia and Maria to stay inside with Mateo, then stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. A sleek black SUV approached, stopping at the gate. To his surprise, Sheriff Nolan emerged. Alongside him stood a stocky man in a dark suit who introduced himself as Agent Fowler from a government medical watchdog. Fowler's eyes were cold, scanning the farm. "Augusto Martin," he said formally, "we have credible evidence of your harboring an illegally obtained infant. I'm here to ensure the child is taken into protective custody." Augusto's knuckles whitened around the rifle. "He's my son," he growled, the words echoing in the still night air. Fowler sneered. "DNA tests may say otherwise. Regardless, the child is part of an ongoing investigation into Dr. Ramirez's unauthorized treatments." "Over my dead body," Augusto said. Sheriff Nolan put a hand up, looking torn. "Augusto, I'm just here to keep the peace. I don't want things to go south." Inside, Maria and Lucia hovered protectively over Mateo. The baby stirred, letting out a cry that echoed through the open door, perhaps sensing the tension. In that moment, a second SUV roared down the road, headlights piercing the gloom. It slid to a stop behind Fowler's vehicle. Out spilled two men in black tactical gear. Hired muscle, by the looks of them. Augusto's heart hammered. This was no simple child protective case. These men were there to remove any loose ends, by any means necessary. A storm of lightning and thunder crashed overhead as the confrontation escalated. Suddenly, from the side of the house, Estrella bounded forward, barking ferociously. The men brandished guns. Fowler shouted orders, and the standoff teetered on the brink of violence. That's when Maria appeared in the doorway, holding Mateo. Her voice rang out into the tension, "Stay back, or I swear we'll make sure the whole world knows what you've done." She held up her phone, camera recording. Evidence, footage, would be crucial. Fowler hesitated. If he acted now, it would all be on record. Sheriff Nolan stepped between them, arms raised. "Easy, everyone. Let's settle this without bloodshed." All at once, the tension broke. Fowler snarled and motioned for his men to stand down. Evidently, the threat of public exposure was too great. "This isn't over," he spat, climbing back into his SUV. Within moments, the vehicles disappeared into the rainy night, leaving only spinning tires in their wake. Relief and adrenaline mixed in Augusto's veins. Sheriff Nolan let out a heavy breath. "Guess I can file a report about intimidation, but it won't be easy. You better keep a record of everything, Augusto." And then came the unexpected twist. As the danger subsided, Lucia stepped forward with tears in her eyes. She handed Augusto a small envelope, found in the final pages of Elisa's locked journal. Within it was a letter from Elisa, written on her deathbed, meant for the day Augusto learned of Mateo's existence. "My dearest Augusto," it read in her gentle cursive, "if you are reading this, then our miracle has found its way home to you. Know that I never wanted to leave you alone. Our love was too strong to simply vanish with my last breath. I believed in this possibility, in the length science and fate might go to preserve what was meant to be, our family. Love him as I would have. And remember, my heart is always with you." Tears flowed freely down Augusto's face, something he hadn't allowed himself in years. He clutched Mateo close, the tiny life that symbolized Elisa's final act of love. The entire journey, his deep isolation, the sudden upheaval, the terrifying threats, led to this moment of overwhelming clarity. Augusto closed his eyes. In the midst of the storm, he felt Elisa's presence, as though she were standing beside him, whispering that it was okay to let go of the pain. At last, he allowed himself to embrace the gift she had left him, a second chance at love, hope, and connection in a world he once shut out. Although the looming threat from powerful interests remained, the evidence they gathered and the local sheriff's continued vigilance offered a fragile layer of protection. Mateo grew stronger with each passing day, nurtured by the father who had rediscovered his heart. The farm's silence was replaced by the sounds of laughter, cooing, and even the barking of puppies and a playful dog named Estrella. In the end, the small community's judgment softened. Neighbors began to see Augusto not as a bitter recluse, but as a man reborn through the mystery child that arrived in his barn. And for Augusto, Every day with Matteo felt like a miracle stitched from the very soul of Elisa, reminding him of the enduring power of love, even when reason fails to explain it. A new chapter of Augusto's life had begun. He stood on the porch one evening, baby in his arms, gazing at the setting sun over the mountains. The golden light seemed to shimmer with Elisa's memory. He whispered his gratitude into the quiet air, ready to face the future as a man no longer broken, but healed, and made whole by the most inexplicable grace.